What if the most feared spirit on Southern soil was never a ghost, but a woman history tried to erase? Why did a reverend abandon his Bible to worship a slave he called divine? And why does no one dare to speak her name, though her quilt keeps showing up where no one leaves it? This isn't just a story. It's a wound that never closed, and it's calling again. If you want more stories like this, forgotten, suppressed, and those we cannot allow to fade, subscribe to the channel. The next case might already be knocking at your door. Sombra roterista, dice. Under the thick, brooding skies of southern Louisiana, 1842, the Oaklight plantation lay still as a tomb. Cotton fields stretched like a pale sea beyond the reach of sight, stirred only by the slow breath of summer winds and the weight of time itself. At its center stood a manor house of decaying grandeur, its white columns smeared with mildew, its windows darkened by velvet drapes that had long ceased to move. The silence that ruled Oaklight was not born of peace, but of something deeper, something learned. Silence was survival. Reverend Thomas Whitmore arrived that year, a man of high brow and rigid posture, with a voice honed by years of preaching in New England chapels. He brought with him a sense of moral certainty and the self-assurance of a man who believed himself chosen, not by men, but by God. Appointed by the regional Methodist circuit to shepherd both plantation owners and their human property, he was expected to restore order and piety to Oaklight. But from the moment his boots touched southern soil, something in him began to unravel. The master of Oaklight had died the winter before, leaving behind a frail widow, Sarah Whitmore, Thomas's cousin and wife, whose lungs were slowly surrendering to a wasting illness. Her mind, too, was fading, though not yet gone. She moved through the halls of the house like a ghost, still tethered to memory, watched over by a young house servant named Eliza. Eliza was not like the others. She spoke little, but her silence was not submission. It was the restraint of someone who saw more than she let on. Her eyes held the weight of generations, and her hands moved with the precision of someone accustomed to being invisible. Reverend Whitmore noticed her the moment he entered the household. At first, he called it a matter of Christian duty. Her soul, he claimed, had a purity untouched by sin. But the glances lingered, the prayers grew longer, and when he began asking for her to attend his private devotions, murmurs stirred among the field hands. Eliza obeyed without protest. She knelt beside his oak lectern as he read from the scriptures, her posture straight, her eyes lowered. He quoted verses of obedience and spiritual redemption. He spoke of her as a lamb among wolves, a child of Ham with a heart of gold. She said nothing. Each night, she returned to the servants' quarters and lay awake, listening to the insects murmur in the walls and the wind scrape against the shutters like fingernails. The other slaves kept their distance. Some believed she had bewitched the preacher. Others thought she was his spy. Only the old cook, Miriam, dared speak to her directly. "You watch yourself, child," she whispered one morning, her fingers rolling dough that smelled faintly of salt and ash. "That man don't see you. He sees a mirror, and mirrors lie." Sarah watched from her bedroom window. Her skin had grown translucent, her voice barely more than breath, but her eyes remained sharp. She asked few questions, but recorded much. In the pages of a linen-bound journal, she scribbled the hours Eliza spent in prayer with Thomas, the changes in his sermons, the way he began to dress in finer robes, to anoint himself with oils, to speak of prophecy and dreams. One evening, as the sky bled red over the fields, Thomas announced that Eliza would assist with Sunday service in the chapel he was restoring behind the house. It was unheard of. A slave, standing near the pulpit. He called it progress. Others called it madness. But none dared defy him. That night, Eliza sat alone by the edge of the slave quarters, her hands clasped in her lap, her face tilted toward the moon. She whispered something, not in English, not in prayer, but in a tongue no one else remembered. And in the dark behind her, two eyes opened, watching, waiting. The chapel stood like a forgotten relic behind the house, its wood swollen with rot, its pews covered in dust. Once a place where overseers and landowners bowed their heads in feigned piety, it had long since fallen silent, until Reverend Whitmore took it upon himself to restore it. He called it his House of Redemption, hammering the nails himself, laying hands upon each board as if resurrecting a holy corpse. But it was not God he intended to summon. Eliza was summoned nightly now. The services began after the candles in the manor dimmed, when even the overseers had drunk themselves into stupor. She arrived barefoot, her hair tied in cloth, her wrists crossed in front of her like a prisoner before judgment. Thomas stood at the pulpit, not as a preacher, but as something else, something watching her with trembling reverence, as though afraid she might dissolve before his eyes. He spoke less of Christ and more of vision. He told her of dreams in which a black woman, robed in fire, walked through the cotton fields with a crown of thorns, unburnt. He said she had whispered to him in the language of angels, and her voice was hers, Eliza, his Eve, his guide through the second Eden. He wrote her name again and again in the margins of his sermons until the parchment darkened with ink and sweat. She listened, always listened, never agreed, never refused. Silence was her armor. In it, she held the scream of centuries. She watched him unravel, inch by inch, like a candle burning from the inside out. The chapel began to fill with strange objects, bones tied with red string, mirrors covered with linen, a horn of ivory carved with unreadable script. He called them relics of spiritual warfare. She knew better. Sarah's condition worsened. Her hands shook when she drank, and her eyes often locked on corners of the room where no one stood. She no longer spoke Eliza's name aloud, but sometimes, when Eliza approached to change her linens, Sarah would grab her wrist with sudden strength and mouth the word, "Run." Eliza only nodded. She had no intention of running. Not yet. One night, the Reverend placed a necklace around Eliza's neck, a thin silver chain with a cross carved not from wood, but from human bone. He said it had belonged to a slave who had hanged himself in the barn, a soul too fragile for divine burden. He called it a gift. She did not remove it. She did not sleep. Among the other slaves, rumors took root like fungus. They said Eliza no longer bled, that animals refused to cross her path, that the Reverend's dog, once savage, now whimpered and hid at her scent. Some began to fear her. Others began to pray near her shadow, hoping proximity to her would mean protection. But she offered no words, no warmth, no denial. She returned each night to the chapel, where hymns were now sung in a strange cadence, half English, half something else. Thomas sang until his voice broke, until his body collapsed against the altar, weeping into her feet. "Forgive me," he whispered. "Forgive me for loving what I was taught to hate." She looked down at him without expression. Inside her, something ancient stirred. One dawn, before the bells rang, she walked alone to the field where the old slave had hanged himself. Beneath the gnarled tree, she placed the bone cross into the soil. She did not pray. She waited. And from somewhere beyond the edge of the trees, a wind rose, though the leaves did not move. Summer thickened like syrup over oaklight, pressing against the skin, the lungs, the soul. Days blurred into one another beneath the oppressive sun. But it was the nights that grew unbearable. The air grew restless. Something unspoken stalked the silence. Even the cicadas, relentless in their chorus, began to falter as though pausing to listen. In the manor house, Reverend Whitmore's sermons took on a strange, fevered tone. No longer rooted in Scripture, he spoke of ancient sins, of ancestral bloodlines tainted by desire, and of a kingdom not built in heaven, but beneath the soil. He held services in the chapel 3 times a week now, never with congregants, only with Eliza, and the door always locked behind them. Sarah Whitmore, though increasingly frail, began to resist her husband's presence. When he entered her room, she turned her face to the wall. When he read to her from his torn, annotated Bible, she pretended sleep, and when he reached to touch her hand, she flinched. Her body was slipping, but her mind had grown sharper in its retreat. Eliza noticed. She spent long hours beside the woman's bed, exchanging no words, only glances, silent compacts between prisoners of different cells. One night, Sarah handed her a folded scrap of parchment. On it, a single name was written in spidery ink, Catherine Moreau. No explanation followed, no context, just the name, and a look in Sarah's eyes that begged secrecy. Eliza hid the note beneath her mattress. It was 2 nights later when the glass shattered. Thomas, drenched in sweat, stumbled through the manor halls just past midnight, screaming about visions. He claimed he had seen fire rain from the sky, had witnessed chains melting into serpents, and heard a voice not of man nor God call out from Eliza's throat. The house awakened in panic. Servants hid behind doors. The overseer's wife crossed herself. By morning, Thomas had locked himself in the chapel. Eliza approached the door, but did not knock. From within, she heard muttering, scripture twisted into something else, something deeper and older. Her eyes lingered on the doorframe, where, just below the iron latch, a faint symbol had been carved. Not English, not Latin. A mark she had seen only once before, stitched into the hem of her late mother's headscarf, long since buried. She returned to Sarah's bedside. The old woman was awake, her eyes bright with something like resolve. She whispered, voice dry as ash, "The name I gave you." She knew what he was. Then she closed her eyes again and would not speak for days. That evening, a mirror cracked in the main hall. No one had touched it. No wind had blown. It splintered from the center outward, as if something within had tried to escape. Eliza watched the shards scatter on the floor, each piece catching the candlelight like a shard of memory. She said nothing, but she began to sew. The cloth she chose was coarse and plain, the thread a faded red. She worked in silence, adding small, deliberate shapes, symbols, lines, circles crossed with diagonal slashes. Each night she sewed another, her fingers moving as if guided by memory rather than thought. Miriam, the cook, caught sight of it once and made the sign of the cross. "That ain't stitching," she murmured. "That's calling." Eliza did not stop. The air in the house was shifting. Paint peeled from the walls. Birds no longer roosted near the windows. Dogs refused to enter the parlor. And somewhere in the field, beneath the hanging tree, something began to grow, twisted, colorless, reaching skyward like a hand clawing from the grave. The name, Catherine Moreau, became an echo that threaded itself through the quiet hours of the plantation, slipping into Eliza's thoughts as she worked, as she walked, as she waited. There was no record of that name among the household ledgers, no mention in the prayer books, no gravestone bore it. Yet when Eliza whispered it aloud, once, in the stillness of night, something in the air seemed to pause, as if the land itself remembered. The library, untouched for years, sat in the west wing of the manor, cloaked in mildew and dust. It had belonged to the plantation's original owner, a Frenchman whose portrait still hung crooked in the corridor, his eyes smeared with age and damp. It was there, behind the warped shelves and cracked leather bindings, that Eliza searched. She sifted through brittle journals, maps stained with candle wax, books of sermons in French and Latin. Hours passed. Days followed. She found nothing. Then, beneath a false bottom in a drawer, she uncovered a bundle wrapped in cloth. Within it, yellowed pages tied with ribbon. A journal. The ink had faded, but the name appeared, scrawled across the first page, Catherine Moreau, 1791. The entries were short, erratic, half in French, half in English. Most were unreadable, but one passage remained intact. "The Reverend watches me like I am fire. He prays and trembles. He calls me vessel. But I have seen what he hides beneath the floorboards of the chapel. The bones were not buried right, and they do not sleep." Eliza closed the journal and held it against her chest. Her breath did not quicken. Her hands did not shake. She felt no fear, only recognition. The name had belonged to a woman who walked the same path, wore the same chains, heard the same whispers. A predecessor not in blood, but in burden. The next Sunday, Thomas held a sermon. For the first time, he invited the plantation's white families, neighbors from nearby estates, aging men in linen suits and women with parasols of lace. They filled the pews, fanning themselves as the heat clung to every surface. Eliza stood behind him at the altar, silent, her eyes lowered. The sermon was madness dressed as prophecy. Thomas spoke of blood as sanctification, of chosen vessels marked by their suffering, of fire as the gate to salvation. He gestured to Eliza, calling her the harbinger of the new covenant. The congregation shifted uncomfortably. Whispers passed like insects through the crowd. No one interrupted. No one dared. Afterward, as the guests departed in silence, Thomas collapsed in the vestry, exhausted, muttering fragments of scripture not yet written. Eliza remained behind. She placed the journal of Catherine Moreau on the pulpit and opened it to the marked page. She left it there, in plain sight. By morning, it had vanished. Sarah's condition had turned. She no longer spoke. Her skin had become papery, her breath shallow. But her eyes, those eyes remained fixed on Eliza whenever she entered. That evening, as Eliza adjusted her pillows, Sarah reached up with skeletal fingers and touched the necklace she wore. Not the cross of bone. Eliza had removed that long ago, but a simple cord with a wooden charm carved in a shape Thomas would not recognize. A charm her mother once wore before being sold to another state. A charm for memory, for clarity. Sarah pressed something into Eliza's hand. A key. No words, just the cold iron and the trembling gesture. Eliza nodded once. That night, she unlocked the chapel cellar. The steps groaned beneath her weight. The air was dense with the scent of old earth and rotting wood. Shelves lined the walls, jars of ash, dried flowers, bones wrapped in cloth, symbols painted in dried blood. At the center, a pit, shallow and wide, half covered by planks. Inside, not bones, but remains, torn garments, hair, teeth. Eliza did not cry. She did not pray. She climbed the stairs, locked the door behind her, and returned to her room. In the morning, she began stitching a new symbol, one not from memory, but born from what she now understood, a name reborn in thread and silence. Catherine had been the first crack. Eliza would be the break. The air over Oaklight turned dry and metallic. Even the rains, when they came, left the ground thirstier than before. Cracks spread through the earth like veins, and the crops began to fail in patches. Livestock grew restless, and the overseer's dogs howled through the night without cause. Something in the land was shifting, like a wound remembering the knife. In the chapel, Reverend Whitmore's sermons grew shorter but more intense, spoken not for a congregation, but for an audience unseen. He no longer invited the neighbors. He no longer addressed the household. His words became mantras, whispered chants that looped like a fever dream, circling back to a single truth, that pain was the path to redemption, that the chosen would suffer for the sake of the blind, and that he had been marked to lead them all through fire. Eliza was no longer his audience. She became his altar. He stopped asking her to kneel. Now he asked her to touch the relics he collected, bits of burnt parchment, bones too small to be animal, pieces of rusted chains he claimed held a holy resonance. He said her skin was necessary, that her blood carried the echo of sacred sorrow. She listened without expression, but each night she returned to her corner of the servant quarters and stitched a new thread. The quilt, once blank, now rippled with symbols, not spells, not prayers, records. Truth made tangible. Sarah had stopped speaking altogether, her body shrinking into itself like a candle dying in its own wax. Eliza still tended to her, washing her, feeding her drops of broth. The key Sarah had given remained hidden beneath Eliza's pillow, though she no longer needed it. What she had found beneath the chapel was no longer secret. It had become a presence. It seeped upward, into the floorboards and walls, into the water, into the breath of the house. One morning, Miriam entered the kitchen to find all the flour in the pantry turned black. Not mold, not insects, just ash. Eliza said nothing, but that night she buried the bone of a bird in the garden, near the root of the fig tree that had never borne fruit. By morning, the branches hung heavy with figs, so dark they looked purple in moonlight. No one ate them. The field hands began to speak her name again, but now in reverence. They left tokens at her door, small offerings of corn husks, carved trinkets, bits of cloth. One left a lock of hair, another, a child's tooth wrapped in paper. None claimed their gifts, none needed to. They all felt the current beneath the surface, the slow awakening of something long silenced. Thomas, unaware or unwilling to see, continued his descent. He carved verses into the walls of the chapel, scratching them with a knife until his fingers bled. He wept at night, singing lullabies in a language no one recognized. Once, he collapsed at Eliza's feet, clutching her skirts like a dying man. "You are the wound," he whispered, "and the cure. I see it now. I see you in the flames." She looked down at him and said nothing. That same night, the chapel caught fire. It burned without wind, without lightning, without cause. The flames moved slowly, deliberately, licking the walls but leaving the cross intact. The altar was consumed, the pews blackened, yet by dawn, the building still stood, hollowed, charred, but whole. Thomas claimed it was a sign, proof of purification. He announced a ceremony of binding to be held in 2 weeks during the harvest moon. He said it would unite flesh and spirit, that it would bring the divine down into the soil, that it would require sacrifice. Eliza returned to her room and removed the final page from Catherine Moreau's journal. On its back, in rushed handwriting, were instructions for an old rite, one never spoken, only written, passed down among women who were never meant to survive. It did not promise salvation, only balance. She folded it carefully and stitched it into the quilt. When she held it up to the candlelight, the patterns wove together into a single symbol, one not of faith nor vengeance, but reckoning, a door sewn in thread, waiting to open. The days shortened, though no season had truly changed. Heat still clung to the trees like sap, but the light bent differently, casting long, misshapen shadows across the fields. The sky, once wide and mercilessly bright, now hung lower, heavy and gray, as though the heavens themselves had grown weary. Something waited in the dusk, not yet formed, but close enough to taste. The plantation worked slower, the overseers distracted, the hands moving with a quiet unease. Conversations fell to whispers, and when Eliza passed, those whispers ceased entirely. She had become more than servant, more than symbol. She was no longer feared, nor trusted. She was observed, like a candle no one dared extinguish, though its flame bent strangely in the dark. Thomas Whitmore prepared. He wore only white now, robes he had sewn himself, embroidered with crooked lines meant to echo holy sigils. His face thinned, his eyes hollowed, yet he carried himself with the trembling ecstasy of a man convinced he had seen the face of the divine. He told no one the full nature of the binding to come, only that it would restore the order of the world, that it would purge the sickness in the soil, that it would bring heaven nearer than breath. The ceremony was set to coincide with the harvest moon, which rose fuller and redder than any remembered. Preparations began at dawn. The chapel, still charred from the fire, was draped in white linens. A circle was drawn in ash around the pulpit. At its center, Thomas placed a shallow bowl carved from stone, filled with water, salt, and a single white feather. He asked for Eliza to dress in the garment he had prepared, simple cotton, dyed with crushed figs and laced with thorn-stitch embroidery. She accepted it without protest, and when she emerged, the silence that followed was not admiration, but dread. The fabric clung to her frame like a second skin, the dark hue absorbing all light, the thorns biting into the seams as though alive. Sarah had not spoken in days. Her breath came shallow, eyes half-lidded, fingers twitching without pattern. But that evening, as the sun fell behind the distant line of cypress trees, she sat upright in her bed for the first time in weeks. She called for Eliza by name. When Eliza entered, Sarah's voice broke like glass. "Don't let him finish it," she whispered. "Whatever he believes, it's not the Lord that listens." She reached beneath her pillow and drew out a small bundle, Eliza's own quilt, taken and folded without her knowing. Sarah had sewn something into its lining, her final act before her voice faded for good. Inside was a strip of red silk, embroidered with a single word, "Endure." Eliza bowed her head once, then left the room for the last time. The ceremony began at midnight. The field hands had not been invited, but they gathered nonetheless, standing beyond the chapel's reach, silent as the graves that dotted the woods. Thomas stood at the altar, face aglow with reflected moonlight, hands outstretched above the bowl. Eliza stood opposite, her eyes dry, her lips still. He spoke in tongues, in broken Latin, in mangled scripture. He spoke of binding heaven to flesh, of making divine union with chosen pain. He lifted a knife, ceremonial, gilded, dull, from disuse. He turned to Eliza, expecting her to kneel. She did not. She stepped forward, slowly, calmly. From within the folds of her garment, she drew the final piece of the quilt, now stitched into a sash, lined with symbols no scripture had ever named. She laid it over the bowl, The water turned black. Thomas stumbled back, muttering, choking. His voice lost its rhythm. He dropped the knife. The wind rose. Behind them, the chapel doors blew open, though no storm had come. Candles snuffed themselves. The air turned cold. Eliza spoke her first words in days. "You were never chosen." And the wind answered. The chapel did not burn again. It simply stopped being a place. After that night, its walls became hollow, its pews dust-laden and untouched, its windows permanently fogged, though no breath ever warmed them. Those who dared enter said the air inside never changed, never moved, never shifted, as though time had refused to follow them through the door. No hymns were sung again, no prayers spoken, only silence, thick and knowing. Thomas Whitmore did not die, at least, not in the way men understand death. He awoke on the floor of the chapel alone, the moon gone, the bowl dry, the sash vanished. Eliza was nowhere to be found. The servants claimed she had walked into the fields and never returned. Others said they saw her by the fig tree, barefoot, face turned toward the soil, whispering names not heard in generations. But when searched, she left no trail. The Reverend did not speak for 2 days. Then, when his voice returned, it was quiet, childlike, and wrong. He no longer preached. He wandered the house muttering apologies, though to whom it was never clear. He refused to enter the chapel again, nor speak Eliza's name. His meals went untouched. His robes grew filthy. He tore the pages from his Bible, not in rage, but with the gentleness of a man erasing a dream. Sarah Whitmore died the following week. Her death was not violent, nor sudden. It was quiet, painless, her body already more spirit than flesh. She passed with the red silk pressed against her chest. Miriam found her smiling. By month's end, the plantation began to empty. The overseers, unnerved by Thomas's silence and the chapel's dead air, sought work elsewhere. The neighboring families withdrew their ties. Trade stopped. The fields, once golden with cotton, now grew wild with weeds and unfamiliar blooms, white flowers with black centers that no one had planted. The quilt reappeared 2 weeks later, folded on the chapel steps. It was untouched by soot, though the steps were stained. The symbols sewn across its face had multiplied, rows upon rows of threads in a language without alphabet. Those who dared look claimed they felt heat rising from it, as if each stitch held something breathing beneath. Thomas saw it once. He stared at it for hours, unmoving, then turned and walked back into the manor. He locked the door behind him. He was not seen again. The house rotted from within. Wood warped, beams collapsed, vines pierced the shutters, but no one took it down. No one claimed the land, not officially. It was left alone, like a grave not meant to be disturbed. Years later, children in the nearby parish told stories of a woman who lived by the fig tree, dressed in black, face wrapped in cloth. They said she whispered to birds, that she fed the wind, that she sang to the bones. No one ever proved it. No one ever tried. But sometimes, on nights when the moon rose red again, a low hum would float across the fields, a sound not of music, but memory, and at its center, a voice, not pleading, not mourning, calling. The years that followed did not unfold. They accumulated, like ash settling in corners, forgotten but never absent. Oaklight remained untouched by time in a way that was unnatural. Vines grew over its gates, roots fractured its pathways, but the house itself stood, silent, sunken, untouched by restoration or destruction. Nature surrounded it, yet refused to claim it fully, as if even decay feared to take hold where something else had already laid its claim. No new owners came. No crops were planted. The land was spoken of, but only in past tense. Those who remembered it lowered their voices, especially when recalling the Reverend, not because of reverence, but because no one knew quite what became of him. What remained of Thomas Whitmore was not man nor ghost, but absence. Those who crept near the manor's edges said they saw flickers in the upper windows, shapes that did not belong to flesh, shadows that did not bend to light, and sometimes, through broken panes, they heard murmuring, not words, but rhythm, like someone speaking to a page that did not answer back. One traveler claimed to have entered the house on a dare. He described the interior as hollowed, the walls covered in faint markings, the floor littered with feathers and pieces of bone arranged in concentric spirals. In the center of the ruined library sat a book, not leather-bound, nor printed, but sewn from cloth and stitched with thread. He did not touch it. He left before nightfall. He never returned. They began to call it the Book of the Unwritten, a quilt, perhaps, but more than that, a record, an archive, a scripture not of doctrine, but of memory and reckoning. No one knew where it came from, though those who had heard the older stories guessed. They spoke of a girl who once sewed symbols into fabric, a girl who was not born free, but left free, who vanished without fleeing, who stayed without being seen. Some believed Eliza had died in the chapel that night, her spirit woven into the sash that turned the water black. Others said she had walked into the woods and kept walking, passing from this world into another. But those who tended to believe the land knew otherwise, because the fig tree still bore fruit, darker now, nearly blue, bitter to taste, and beneath it, sometimes, a shape could be seen at dusk, a figure with cloth around her shoulders and bare feet rooted in the earth. She never moved when watched, but if one looked away, even for a breath, she would be gone. The quilt itself vanished again after the traveler's tale, taken by no one, reclaimed by nothing, but its pattern had already begun to spread across other plantations, in carvings on trees, in songs passed from mother to daughter in the corners of kitchens, symbols scratched behind loose boards, etched into combs, sewn into the hems of skirts. Not all who carried them understood what they meant, but they carried them still, because something had shifted. Because pain once swallowed now had shape, and shape once given cannot be forgotten. In the churchyard of a distant town, a new minister once found a strange pattern scratched into the stone beneath his pulpit. He covered it with a rug. Days later, it reappeared, burned faintly into the wood itself. He left the church within the month. He would not speak of what he saw, only that the name had been written there. Not Whitmore, not Catherine, but Eliza, alone, repeated, as if the earth, long silenced, had finally begun to speak. There came a season when the wind refused to pass over Oaklight. Travelers noted it first, wagons stalled on the main road, horses unsettled, as if the landscape ahead carried a silence too dense to cross. The air just beyond the old fence line no longer moved. Trees leaned inward. The soil grew still, and in that stillness, something took root that was not meant to grow. No one lived there, not truly. The house remained as it had for decades, its porch sagging, its windows staring, its door shut tight against both time and trespass. But inside, the dust did not settle like dust should. It rose and hung, weightless, pulsing in slow rhythm, like breath. The hearth remained cold, yet ash gathered on the floor anew each morning, forming faint lines like script not yet written. Whispers persisted. Children born long after the fire dreamed of the chapel and its altar, though none had seen it. Old women warned their daughters against wandering too close, not with fear, but with respect. They spoke of the woman under the fig tree, the one who had no name but left it behind. Some said she lived beneath the earth now, her breath rising through the roots, feeding the tree that bore fruit even in drought. Others claimed she had never been flesh at all, that Eliza had only ever been the echo of a prayer unspoken too long, a reflection of the wounds passed through generations, a mirror held up to a nation unwilling to see. In the northern hills, far from Louisiana's slow rivers, a preacher once confessed to seeing her. He described a figure standing at the edge of his tent revival, barefoot, robed in threadbare cotton, the color of wet soil. She said nothing, but as he spoke of salvation, her gaze never left him, and his voice faltered. He never preached again. The next day, he left his Bible by the river and walked into the woods. He was never found. In other places, across other fields, stories multiplied. Women carried their babies swaddled in quilts that bore her symbols. Men tattooed her marks into their arms without knowing their meaning. In prisons, one inmate carved her name into the wall of his cell again and again, only to find the wall clean by morning. A soldier claimed her voice woke him from sleep just before a bullet passed through the tent where he'd lain. He survived. He never slept again. Yet through all the sightings, all the signs, she never spoke. Her silence endured, until the day someone heard her hum. It came not from Oaklight, but from a small, unmarked grave behind a collapsed barn in another state. A woman tending nearby heard a low melody rising from beneath the soil, broken, ancient, beautiful. She pressed her ear to the earth and wept without knowing why. The next day, she returned with fabric and needle. She began to sew. And so the choir began, not of voices raised in praise, but of hands moving through cloth, of thread guiding memory, of pain no longer swallowed but offered to the wind. They stitched the old names and the new ones, the vanished and the forgotten, the taken and the returned. They sewed not to remember, but to continue, because what had happened at Oaklight had not ended. It had only changed shape, and now the land itself remembered the song. It is said that places do not forget. That land, once marked by sorrow, never truly heals. It only learns how to hold its pain more quietly. Oaklight was such a place, a wound beneath the surface of the South, hidden not by denial, but by dust, overgrown paths, and time's refusal to clarify what memory dared not name. No one spoke of Reverend Thomas Whitmore anymore. His name did not survive in ledgers, nor sermons, nor stone. Whatever he had hoped to build through doctrine and obsession had long since crumbled, not with fury but with indifference. His faith, like the house he haunted, had been hollowed from within, devoured not by sin but by silence, a silence he had never understood, one he had tried to shape, and in doing so had been unmade by it. Eliza's name, however, endured, not as a myth, not as a warning, but as a resonance. A presence that moved through the lives of those who had never seen her face. She was carried not by stories, but by instinct, by the way women paused when the wind changed, by the unease that followed cruelty like a shadow, by the quilts passed from hand to hand, stitched not with comfort, but with remembrance. In one town, a church was built over the ruins of an older one. Workers found bones beneath the foundation, wrapped in cloth that had not rotted. The preacher insisted on reburying them, but the elder women demanded they be left untouched. They brought salt, water, and 3 black stones. No questions were asked. No answers were given. In another, a freedwoman kept a ledger of every child born within a 10-mile radius. She marked their names, their weights, and their cries. But for one child, born under a red moon, without breath and then with it, she wrote only a single word beside his entry: Eliza. When asked why, she simply said, because she waited. Even farther north, beyond the reach of moss-covered trees and cotton fields, a scholar researching abolitionist hymns found a melody in a half-burned notebook. The lyrics were incomplete, written in a mix of languages, some African, some English, some unknown. But the refrain appeared in each stanza, stitched like thread through each verse. She was never bound. She was never broken. She is the weight they could not carry. The scholar tried to trace the origin, found nothing, until, on a faded map from the early 1800s, she saw the name Oaklight, and beside it, handwritten in red ink, a single word circled 3 times: witness. There are places now where her symbols appear with no author, carved into benches, woven into church sashes, marked on gravestones too weathered for names. They are not announcements. They are not signs. They are acknowledgments, because some wounds must be seen to stop bleeding, and some names, once spoken by the earth itself, refuse to be silenced, not out of vengeance, but because they are owed. Eliza was never claimed by fire, nor by death, nor by the man who tried to wear her as prophecy. She walked past the veil built by those who thought themselves chosen, and she left it open behind her, not to invite, but to remind. She had been property. She had been vessel. She had been story. And now she was voice, a voice that hums still, low and steady, beneath the weight of every unmarked grave, every silent altar, every prayer caught in the throat, a name that lingers, because she stayed. There is a fabric that predates thread, a weaving not done by hand, but by history, by breath, by blood. It runs beneath the surface of every field, tilled in bondage, beneath every foundation built by hands that were never paid, beneath every altar where names were left out of Scripture. It is not seen, but it is felt, in the way fire sometimes bends toward earth, or how birds fall silent when passing over certain places. It is not myth, it is not ghost, it is memory given form. Long after Oaklight was left to rot, a woman arrived with no name and no companions. She wore black, not from mourning, but because it made her unseen. She did not knock, she did not ask, she simply passed through the gates, now nothing more than rusted hinges leaning into weeds, and the land did not resist her. She walked the perimeter first, each step deliberate, like tracing an old wound. Her hands brushed the bark of trees that had stood longer than law. Her fingers paused at the fig tree, still alive, though bent with age and scarred by time. At its base, she knelt, not to pray, but to listen. What she heard was not sound, it was pulse, the low, steady hum of something that had waited long enough. Inside the manor, the walls had collapsed. Dust hung in sheets, thick and undisturbed. Yet the woman moved without coughing, without fear. She climbed the remains of the staircase, stepping over splinters and bones of birds too old to name. In the study, the air grew cold. There, buried beneath what was once a desk, she uncovered the final quilt, not the first, not the last, but the one that had never been meant to be found. It was small, roughly sewn, symbols misaligned, as though hurried, but its center bore the unmistakable shape, a door, flanked by two eyes. Above it, no thread, only ash fused into the cloth, forming a single word burned in silence. Leave. She did not touch it. She only sat beside it and waited. Night came fast over Oaklight. Shadows reclaimed what little light the sky offered. But inside the study, a glow remained, not from candle nor moon, but from the fabric itself. Not bright, but present, like something alive beneath the fold. The woman opened a pouch at her hip and withdrew a needle, bone, smoothed by age. She drew a single strand of hair from her own head and threaded it. With slow precision, she began to sew, not on the quilt, but into the floor beside it, stitching symbols that did not belong to any alphabet, but to grief and oath. She did not speak. She only stitched. By morning, the quilt was gone. So was the woman. But on the floor where she had sat, the thread remained, taut, unbroken, red as vein. It led out the door, down the steps, into the field. And when the wind rose, as it did once each season now, it carried with it no dust, no scent, only a sound, a rustle, as of cloth dragging across the earth.